What time is it? Engine runtime time. So I don't actually know if that's the proper term for it. I've been calling it the engine runtime because I've just been referring to edengine as edengine. But basically it's the actual engine part of the editor engine combo. So it's the part where you click play and it actually makes the game run. So good news is the game engine is basically just the room editor without the editor part. So it should be pretty simple. The only thing I'm planning on taking a lot of time is the logic editor nodes. So right now the logic editor is just kind of empty. The nodes that exist are just placeholders. And so that means when I'm developing the engine, once I get the basic drawing, navigation, input handling, stuff like that handled, then it's going to be a job of just going through a bunch of use cases one by one and making sure I have all the logic nodes to be able to support those use cases. Executing the logic node, pretty easy, and hopefully quick. But going through one by one all the use cases is going to take some time. But we'll see how it goes.
Wait, hold on, I actually need to solve another problem first. If you remember back a little bit, one of the goals for this project was that a user will be able to export the runnable game to a single HTML file. This means that at some point, the editor will need to access the raw engine code as text in order to be able to pack it into an HTML file along with the game data. This is a problem because I also need the engine as runnable code in the editor so that the user can quickly preview their game. Programs like Bitsy solve this basically just by duplicating the code, importing one version directly into the editor and packing one version as a string variable that can be used when building the final app. Now, as a programmer, I really hate this solution. Nothing against Bitsy, but it not only means that the engine code is duplicated, but there's a ton of shared code between the engine and the editor that would be duplicated as well. Even worse, the shared code would be duplicated not twice, but 3 times. Once in the editor's code, once in the runnable version of the engine that runs in the editor, and once in the string version of the engine that sits around waiting to be packed into the HTML output. I asked around the internet for different ways to solve this, but pretty much everybody just told me that what I was doing was basically impossible and I should just accept all the duplication. But I'm determined to do it anyways. While Bitsy duplicates the engine code, their idea of compiling the engine code to an importable string variable gave me an idea. After a bit of experimenting, I actually found a solution that solved all of my problems. If I compile the engine and shared libraries into strings, I can import those, which get packed into the editor when it's built. Then on load, I can assign the contents of those string variables to script tags, then clear the string variables so the only copy is in the tags. By assigning them to script tags, not only does the code become runnable, but I can query the script tags at any time and grab the inner HTML as text, allowing me to easily pack the data into the HTML executable when it's time. This is especially handy for the shared code, as both the engine and editor code could easily access all the shared functions and data classes globally using the shared namespace. I started by separating out all of the shared library code into its own folder and then set up a simple build system to bundle it into a single variable. Before I knew it, the editor was, well, working exactly how it was before, but now it means I can start working on the engine. Time to build our first game. Nah, who am I kidding? We still have to build the engine. First thing is to set up the render loop that just renders a black screen for testing and then set it up so that it builds and imports itself into the editor similar to how the shared library does it. Next, I can start working on a preview window in the editor. It's basically just more simple HTML and CSS. The only JavaScript really involved here is creating a new engine instance, which is just a little bit of boilerplate. Right now, the debug and standard play buttons only change the text to the top, but in the future, I want to expand this to include some handy debug options. With all the issues I had writing the renderers for the art and room editors, I was really dreading writing the engine renderer, but it turned out really easy. Basically, it was just the existing room editor without any of the extra visual junk I had to add to represent like tools and stuff. I'm still kind of staring at a black screen though, which means next is to have the editor send the engine the game data. And we have a room! After that, I wrote a template HTML file that did more or less the same thing with like all the engine boilerplate and stuff, and had it compile to a string in the same file as the engine. And now I can build the HTML executable as well. Time to finally build our... Hang on. As cool as it is to actually have something happen when we click the play button, currently nothing actually runs and is completely non-interactive. Speaking of interactions though, So the way the editor stores logic nodes is completely useless to the engine. The editor stores them as two separate lists, a list of nodes and a list of connections. This makes it easier to draw and manipulate in the viewport. For the engine though, the connections just need to be object references. So the first thing to do in getting nodes to work is parse the list of nodes and connections into an actual tree data structure linking nodes directly to each other as references. From there it's pretty simple. When an event fires, we start at the event node. We then follow the node reference plugged into its trigger socket to see which node needs to run next. Then, the code for that node runs. If the node's code requires data from a socket, we either retrieve the input data, or if it's connected to another node, we recursively trace the tree backwards from that socket until we have the data we need. Finally, we fire off the appropriate trigger socket and repeat the cycle. It was actually really fun making the node API. I didn't know what type of features I'd need, so I just started free writing nodes and let that kind of dictate how I would build the API. First, I'm going to write some basic math nodes to make sure all the linking and executing actually works, and it does! I gotta say, this is probably the most excited I've ever been to see a computer doing basic math. I wrote some basic tiled movement nodes, but trying to build a node tree with it became obvious that this current setup isn't going to work. Currently, each event has its own separate tree, but especially when it comes to things like keyboard inputs, having just one event node which has to be checked against for each possible input is going to get really messy really fast. As much as I hate to do it, it looks like I'm going to have to do a pretty big redesign of how I imagine this UX working. The whole goal of the current design was to keep things clean by default. One event per graph means that the entry point is always incredibly obvious. By not allowing more than one type of the same event to be created, it's easier to avoid unexpected behavior, especially from people who are just getting started with programming. Seeing as I can't come up with any better ideas though, my new plan is to have the user be able to add multiple events per graph. If they add more than one event of the same type, they'll just be executed in a random order. I'll probably add a small warning if a user adds two of the same events to a script, but we'll see how that turns out. I'm also going to allow multiple custom graphs to be added, where each graph is just a blank canvas to add any nodes you want. Finally, while it doesn't pertain to the graphs themselves, I plan to add some functionality called widgets to nodes to allow for special features. For example, one of them being a press key to select type widget for easily setting keyboard input. Now, in my head, this was a massive overhaul, but it turned out to just be some basic cosmetic tweaks, with only a super tiny bit of logic actually being changed in how node data is stored and parsed. Adding widget functionality was also pretty simple and should allow for a lot of cool specialized nodes in the future. With that out of the way, we finally get to make our first game. I mean, make the text renderer. I feel like a basic feature we need for games is some kind of text box ability to communicate stuff to the player. Once again, the fact that this all has to live in a single HTML file is proving to be quite the challenge. I can't use a font file for text since pixelated font files are incredibly large and difficult to load from embedded data in the HTML file. I can't directly use an image because once again I'll have to embed that in some way, and I can't embed the raw image data either since it would be multiple times the size of the file and base64 encoding it would be even bigger. I felt like an image atlas was the best way to go though, so after finding a nice font image that someone provided for free, thank you, I got to work experimenting on different ways I could encode and embed the file. My solution is a little bit funky and now relies on a third build script, but it does what I need to do. First, the script downloads the image from a remote URL. Storing binary data in Git repo has always been a pain and I'd rather just avoid it. Since the image is only black and white pixels, I can treat those as binary ones and zeros and pack up to 32 pixels into a single number. Bitpacking is where instead of having a bunch of individual ones and zeros all stored as separate numbers, we repeatedly bit shift a binary number and store all the ones and zeros into a single binary number. I tried doing run length encoding as well, but bitpacking seemed to be more efficient. Bitpacking managed to cut it down a lot, but left a ton of zeros behind, so I RLE'd only the zeros and then numerically encoded all the numbers to base64, which trimmed it down even further. I could then pack the data, the character key, and some basic decoding functions into the final file. However, unlike the shared in engine code, the compiled font data is imported directly into the engine, so it gets bundled with the engine code. Actually getting text to draw was the worst mix of maddening and boring. Text isn't the most exciting thing to start with, but when you start getting into automatic word wrapping and other text features, things start to go wrong and they don't make a lot of sense when they do. Good news is, now that it's done, I hopefully don't have to mess around with it again for a long time. I also added basic dialog boxes and a way to have text scroll onto the screen, which is really just a cherry on top. Haha, just kidding, I'm going on vacation. As always, I usually end up programming on the beach while taking breaks from the sun, so I try not to work on any big tasks I couldn't complete in 1 or 2 short sittings. Even though what I was working on wasn't all that exciting, the locals constantly stopped by to check on what I was making. I also did some work on automatic type detection, so when you set variables to a certain type, it's reinforced across the editor. Combined with type conversion, this should make using variables a lot more intuitive. Since I was working on a laptop this trip and getting fed up with how blurry everything constantly was, I added high DPI support to both the engine and the editor. Finally, I added drag and drop support to the asset browser, animation editor, and logic graphs, just to prove that one person in the comments wrong. Almost exactly 2 years ago, I was standing on this deck, just getting started on this whole entire project, getting started on the art editor, implementing things, just the basic things like color picker and getting the UI worked out. And now here I am, back once again, and I'm about to finish this project, and I gotta say, it's more than a little surreal. Is this it? Are we finally gonna do it? Yes, it is finally time to start making the first game. But first, a word from our sponsor, Nah, I'm just kidding. Nobody pays me. Somebody please pay me. I'm now glad to say that with everything basically running roughly how it should be, I'm switching to use case development. As I go through making these games, I'll not only run into roadblocks that'll tell me what I need to add next, but it'll also show me some smaller usability issues that I wouldn't have spotted otherwise. The first game is a simple maze game and has the following requirements. I need to be able to move and collide in a tile-based manner. Keys need to be able to be picked up to unlock doors, which means I need to add and be able to set variables. I need to be able to move between rooms, and there also needs to be some kind of simple animation support. As I made my way through the list, most of this stuff was pretty simple. I got a little hung up on room transitions and animations as there were some timing and position issues, but other than that, things went pretty smoothly. It's weird, I spent so much time working on one part of the editor or the other. Considering this is the first time I've actually used the editor to make something, I'm surprised at how smooth it feels. And now the moment we've all been waiting for, press play, and we have our first running game.
It's working! It's working!
This is probably my favorite thing in game design, when you finally run what you've been working on and watch as it comes to life. So that last episode was recorded in June. A lot of exciting and somewhat chaotic things have happened since then. That's why I'm only uploading this in November. But yeah, I'll have a life update video coming out on a lot of stuff soon because it's been a crazy year and a half and I have a lot of stories to tell. If you're looking for a way to contribute and help support this channel, as always, liking and subscribing is a fantastic way to do so, and I'm also experimenting with that new thanks button that you'll see down below. So if you want to financially help out this channel and the project, that's probably a great way to do it. And as always, I will see you next time.